In 1959, the Reserve Bank of India issued a highly unusual batch of banknotes. They came in standard denominations, 1, 5, 10, and 100 rupees, but they were printed in distinct, entirely different colors than the standard currency. The strange color palette served a specific legal purpose. Attempting to spend one of these brightly colored notes in Delhi or Bombay was a federal crime. There were millions of these notes in circulation, passing from hand to hand every single day. Yet inside the borders of the very country that minted them, they had absolutely zero financial value. The Indian government had intentionally engineered these notes as a targeted financial weapon to stop a hidden economic war draining the country's wealth. For centuries, a deep network of maritime trade connected India's western ports to the Middle East. Merchant ships constantly moved back and forth across the Arabian Sea, exchanging pearls, dates, and spices. Because of this constant commercial flow, by the mid-20th century, the Indian rupee had become the default pocket money for the entire region. People in Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, Oman, and modern-day UAE relied heavily on the Indian rupee for their everyday transactions. That arrangement worked smoothly until the years following 1947. A network of opportunists realized they could exploit the freely convertible nature of the rupee to build a highly lucrative, illicit offshore trade. This flowchart illustrates the exact mechanics of the loophole. Smugglers took vast amounts of legal Indian rupees to the Gulf, where they purchased gold completely tax-free. They then secretly transported that physical gold back into India, selling it at a massive markup. But because the rupee was freely convertible, those offshore merchants would eventually cash out their holdings. Every time this smuggling cycle completed, the resulting conversions secretly siphoned off India's sovereign foreign exchange reserves. Decades of historical trade had forced India into acting as the central bank for the entire Gulf. But this gold smuggling loophole was quite literally bankrupting the newly independent nation. To stop the bleeding, the Indian Parliament executed a drastic legislative intervention in 1959. They passed a law to completely sever the money supply of the Gulf from India's domestic economy. The Reserve Bank engineered a new, isolated currency system. By printing the standard rupee notes in entirely different colors, they created the Gulf Rupee. This allowed the government to legally quarantine the offshore money from their domestic reserves. The maneuver worked exactly as intended. The gold smuggling loophole slammed shut overnight, and for a brief window, India successfully dictated the monetary policy of the Middle East. But the geopolitical reality of the region was already shifting beneath their feet. The discovery of massive oil reserves was rapidly flooding the Gulf with new capital. The Gulf Rupee solved India's smuggling crisis, but the sudden influx of petrodollars meant these states were becoming far too wealthy to remain dependent on a foreign power's fiscal decisions. Some nations were already taking steps toward monetary independence to manage their newfound purchasing power. Kuwait began minting its own sovereign currency, the dinar, in 1961, followed by Bahrain in 1965. Then came the shock of June 6, 1966. Facing immense domestic economic pressure, the Indian government enacted a severe and sudden devaluation of the rupee. This chart illustrates the severity of the drop. Against the US dollar, the peg fell off a cliff, dropping from 4.76 rupees to the dollar all the way down to 7.50. Because the Gulf rupee's value was strictly pegged to the domestic Indian rupee, the remaining Gulf states found themselves locked into the crash. A massive chunk of their purchasing power evaporated overnight. This devaluation broke the financial bond with the Gulf states. To their rulers, it represented a breach of trust that demonstrated the danger of outsourcing a national money supply. The political fallout was immediate. Furious Gulf rulers demanded that Britain intervene and force India to restore the value of their holdings. But the Indian decision was absolute. What followed was a rapid monetary divorce. Within months, Qatar and Dubai dumped the Gulf Rupee. They temporarily adopted the Saudi Riyal to stabilize their markets before launching their own dedicated currencies. Oman was the final holdout. When they officially abandoned the Gulf notes in 1970 to mint the new Omani Riyal, the system was fully dismantled. The sudden shock of the 1966 devaluation acted as a catalyst. It forced the Gulf states to rapidly accelerate the creation of the independent, highly capitalized central banks that govern their massive economies today. Looking at the towering modern skyline and sovereign wealth of the Gulf today, it is difficult to imagine that their entire economic foundation was once dictated by paper printed in Bombay. Those physically distinct, brightly colored Gulf rupees are now incredibly rare. They survive mostly as forgotten artifacts locked behind glass in museum displays. Yet a subtle linguistic legacy survived the divorce. If you walk through a market in modern Bahrain, you will still hear locals casually referring to 100 fils as a rupee. It leaves the Gulf Rupee as an incredible historical paradox. A localized currency created strictly to stop domestic gold smugglers inadvertently set the stage for the financial independence of the modern Middle East.